Hi and welcome to Psychology 2. We're going to look at biology and psychology. Consider this. A 44-year-old man arrived at the hospital complaining of weakness in his left leg. A married man of 2 children. He currently works as a civil servant, so that's kind of like a social worker. And as a child, he had been diagnosed with hydrocephalus. So that's a condition in which fluid is retained in the brain, and it causes the head to swell. In order to treat the disorder, the doctor had placed a drain in his head so that the excess of fluid could flow into his stomach without impacting his brain development. His neurological development and medical history were otherwise normal until he returned to the hospital as an adult. The doctors decided to do an MRI to look at the man's brain, and what they saw astounded them. The man's brain had almost entirely compressed by buildup of fluid, yet the only symptom the man showed was a bit of weakness in his left leg. Reducing the amount of fluid in the man's head reduced the pressure on what remained of his brain and relieved the weakness in his left leg, but did not change the massive amount of fluid-filled space in his brain. So how could this man live such a normal life with such a small amount of brain? Removing a comparable amount of an adult's brain would very likely bring about death and would certainly prevent him or her from maintaining a job and a family. However, the human brain is remarkably flexible or plastic, particularly during development. Since the civil servant brain was most likely compressed gradually during development, it was able to adapt and function for all intents and purposes, perfectly normally. In this chapter, we're going to learn about distinct structures of the brain, their respective functions, and how much more, much more from neurons, the microscopic, to the visible structures that provide the basis for functions such as memory, speech, sensation, thought, planning, and voluntary movement. All right, so we're going to begin with the nervous system and how we're wired, and we're going to look at that complex living network, which is neurons. Everything that we do, see, hear, think, and feel is based on our biology. Neurons are the base component of what makes up our brain. How do neurons work? When we consider neurons, we see that there are 3 structures of a neuron. There's a cell body, known as a soma, dendrites, and axon. The cell body, or the soma, contains the nucleus and carries out the metabolic or life-sustaining functions of a neuron. The dendrites, they branch out from the cell body and are the primary receivers of signals from other neurons. They can relay messages backwards to the cell body, to their own branches. That's called backpropagating. And then the axon is a slender tail-like extension of the neuron that sprouts into many branches, each ending in a round axon terminal. The axon terminal transmits signals to the dendrites or the cell bodies of other neurons, and then to our muscles, glands, and other parts of the body. Now, in addition, the glial cells are specialized cells that help the efficiency of the brain. They clean out the waste and dead neurons and make the myelin coating for the axon. As neurons are not actually connected to one another physically, the synapse is the junction point between a neuron at the axion terminal. They are filled with gaps between the 2 neurons. They're very close, but they're not joining. And that is called the synaptic cleft, the point of communication between 2 neurons. Myelin is the fatty substance around the axon that facilitates conduction. Now, the neurons perform 3 tasks. There's the afferent, which is the sensory neurons that relay messages from the sense organs and receptors, your eyes, ears, nose, mouth, and skin, to the brain or the spinal cord. Secondly is the efferent or the motor neurons, and they convey signals from the brain and the spinal cord to the glands and muscles, which enable us to move. And then thirdly are the interneurons, thousands of times more numerous than sensory or motor neurons, and they carry information between neurons in the brain, between neurons in the spinal cord. Now the neural impulse is a message that travels along the neuron between 3 and 360 kilometers an hour. An electrochemical voyage, this is what essentially neurons, so how do neurons communicate with one another? Well, it's with the mechanism that enables this communication to occur as frequently as it does. So we're going to review the process of a neuron communicating. Keep in mind, this is essentially an electrical, not the kind of electricity in your home. The action potential is the firing of a neuron that results when the charge within the neuron becomes more positive than the charge outside the cell's membrane. So when the neuron is at rest, it's not firing, the inside of the neuron has a slight negative charge compared to the outside. This is referring to the neuron's resting potential. When a neuron is stimulated, more positively charged particles flow into the cell, making the inside suddenly positive compared to the outside of the cell. This sudden reversal is the action potential. Immediately after the neuron fires, some positive particles are actively pumped out of the cell. The neuron returns to its resting potential and is ready to fire again if stimulated. Now, I touched on the synapse. The synapse is a junction. It's a fluid-filled gap between the neurons. And as neurons are not actually connected to one another physically, the synapse is the junction point between the neuron and the axon terminal. There are filled gaps between two neurons in the axon terminal. They're called synaptic clefts, the point of communication between two neurons. Now, neurotransmitters, these are the chemical messages of the brain. Now, what role do they play in the transmission of signals between neurons? When a neurotransmitter enters the receptor sites on the dendrite or the cell bodies of receiving neurons, their action is either excitatory, influencing the neurons to fire, or inhibitory, influencing them not to fire. Although many other neurotransmitters have been identified, we continue to think of acetylcholine as one of the most important neurotransmitters. Curare is a poison that was discovered in by South American Indians, and they put it on the tips of their darts that can shoot from blowguns. Curare blocks acetylcholine receptors, paralyzing internal organs as a result. The victim is unable to breathe and dies. This is an inhibitory effect. The substance in the venom of a black widow spider simulates the release of acetylcholine in the synapses. Botulism is a toxin found in improperly canned foods, and it blocks the release of acetylcholine at the synapses and has a deadly effect. It takes less than 1/1,000,000th of a gram of this toxin to kill a person. The deficit of acetylcholine is associated with Alzheimer's disease, which affects a high percentage of older adults. Many transmitters have been identified in the years since 1921, and there's an increasing evidence of the importance in the human behavior. Psychoactive drugs affect the consciousness because of their effects on the synaptic transmission. For example, cocaine and amphetamines prolong the action of certain neurotransmitters, and opiates imitate the action of natural neuromodulators called endorphins. This is an excitatory effect. It appears that the neurotransmitter dopamine, or norepinephrine, or serotonin, are associated with some of the most severe forms of mental illness. There are only a few ounces of these substances in the body, but they may have a profound effect on mood, memory, perception, and behavior. Could intelligence be primarily a matter of having plenty of the right neurotransmitters at the right synapses? let's look at the following transmitters. We're going to look at acetylcholine, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, serotonin, amino acids, and endorphins. So let's begin with acetylcholine, which was first to be discovered, and it's an excitatory transmitter. It causes our muscles to contract. It has an inhibitory effect on the muscle fibers of the heart, which keep the heart from beating too fast. It's also playing a role in stimulating neurons involved in learning new information. Acetylcholine affects movement, learning, memory, REM, sleep. Now, another important class of neurotransmitters is known as monoamines, including 4 transmitters: dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and serotonin. Like acetylcholine, dopamine produces both excitatory and inhibitory effects and is involved in several functions, including learning, attention, movement, and reinforcement. It's also important to our ability to feel pleasure. Low levels of the neurotransmitter dopamine have been found to cause Parkinson's disease, and increased levels of dopamine have been linked to the psychological disorder known as schizophrenia. Dopamine affects learning, attention, movement, and reinforcement. Norepinephrine affects our eating habits. It stimulates the intake of carbohydrates and plays a major role in alertness and wakefulness. Serotonin, it produces an inhibitory effect at most of the receptors with which it forms a synapses. It plays an important role in regulating mood, sleep, impulsivity, aggression, and appetite. It has also been linked to depression and anxiety disorders. Some antidepressant drugs relieve symptoms of depression by blocking the uptake of serotonin or norepinephrine. Thus, it increases the neurotransmitter's availability in the synapses. Now, there are 2 amino acids of particular importance that are found more often than others in the central nervous system: glutamate, or glutamic acid, and GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid. Now, glutamate is a primary exciter neurotransmitter in the brain, and it may be released by 40% of the neurons, and it's active in the higher brain centers that are involved in learning, thought, and emotions. GABA is the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain and is widely distributed throughout the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and it was thought to facilitate the control of anxiety in humans. Tranquilizers, barbiturates, and alcohol appear to have a calming and relaxing effect because they bind with and stimulate one type of GABA receptor and thus increase GABA's anxiety-controlling effect. Endorphins are opiate-like substances produced naturally by the brain that provide relief from pain and stress of vigorous exercise and produce a feeling of pleasure and well-being. So now let's go and review, because I've made mention to our central nervous system, let's review our central nervous system. First, the major structures and the major functions of those structures. The nervous system is divided into 2 parts: the central nervous system, which is composed of the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which connects the central nervous system to all parts of the body. So let's consider the parts of the central nervous system. The body's central processing unit, the spinal cord. Column of nerves transmit messages from sensory receptors to the brain and from the brain to the muscles and glands throughout the body. The term spinal reflex, this is an unlearned response to a stimulus that may involve only 2 neurons, the afferent or sensory and the efferent or motor. The spinal cord and the brain have both gray and white matter. Gray matter is the non-myelinated neurons, and it's found in the brain and the spinal cord. White matter, myelated neurons, are found in the brain and the spinal cord. repeating myself, sorry. The peripheral nervous system. Now, the body's peripheral devices, as mentioned just a second ago, the PNS, or the peripheral nervous system, connects with the central nervous system at all other parts of the body. The two main divisions of the PNS are the somatic and autonomic systems. Now, the somatic nervous system, here the afferent and efferent neurons that transmit sight, sound, and smells, temperature, and body position and things, these are purposeful body movements. The autonomic nervous system automatically or automates, regulates the glands and internal organ muscles, heartbeat, respiration, digestion, dilation of pupils, etc. We don't control those consciously, they occur. The automatic nervous system has two branches. And I will show you a little graphic here that puts that together to show you how all these things connect. There's a sympathetic division, which is active during process that involves spending body energy, flight or fight. And then there's the parasympathetic division. This is active during processes that replenish our reserves of energy. So you might want to look at the figure 2.5 and figure 2.7 in your textbook for a graphic of these divisions of the nervous system and the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. Now, we're going to touch on the brain, experimenting with the brain and sort of how does it function. Accidents and diseases have been very important and a big influence on science gaining understanding of brain function. Accidents provide unplanned, uncontrolled opportunities of studying the brain. If you look in your book, Phineas Gage of 1848 is an example of one of the first sort of medically based ones that they studied. Or if you've ever had a concussion, you probably have some insight into the brain functioning about what happens when you have a concussion. Looking into the brain, it's not easy. Some technology has had a great success at witnessing or recording brain activities. The EEG, or the electroencephalograph, detects minute amounts of electrical activity in the brain, or our brain waves. Our other brain imaging techniques include the CAT, or the computerized axial tomography, CAT, a scan that passes a narrow X-ray beam through our head and measures brain structures, generating a three-dimensional image of the brain. It reveals deformities in its shape and its structure that are connected with blood clots, tumors, or other health problems. The PET, or positron emission tomography, this is a computer-generated image of the activity of parts of the brain by tracing the amounts of glucose used. A harmless amount of radioactive compound, or a tracer, is mixed with glucose and injected into the bloodstream. It's used to see which parts of the brain are most active when we are engaged in various activities, whether that's listening to music or working at a math problem. Then there's the MRI, or the magnetic resonance imaging. Here the person lies in a powerful magnet field and is exposed to radio waves that cause part of the brain to emit signals. It relies on subtle shifts in blood flow. The MRI has shown people with schizophrenia have smaller prefrontal regions but larger ventricles. Another technique is what's known as fMRI, so that's functional magnetic resonance imaging. It enables researchers to observe the brain while it's working. And lastly is even a newer approach. It's known as diffusion tensor imaging, or DTI, where the measurement of water molecules that are in and around neurological structures, creating a stunning and very detailed map of the neural pathways. Excuse me. So if we're going to look at the brain and sort of explore it a bit, I just want to get an idea. You should not already know this already, but you might, that your brain is a complex organ and involves many unseen activities that enable us to live our lives. We sleep, we wake up, we think, we emote, we love, we understand math. So let's have a look. We'll start with the hind brain. This is where the spinal cord meets the brain. The spinal cord descends from the brain and transmits messages between the brain and the peripheral nervous system, the brainstem, the pons, the cerebellum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the cerebral hemispheres, including the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. So the brainstem, we'll start there, contains 1, the medulla, which controls heartbeat, breathing, blood pressure, coughing, and swallowing. The pons, which transmits information about the body movement that it's involved in, that's involved in functioning related to attention, sleep and alertness, and respiration. And then the third part of the hindbrain is the reticular formation, also known as the reticular activating system, or RAS, which plays a crucial role in arousal and attention. Now, cerebellum, this means little brain. The main function of the cerebellum is to execute smooth, skilled movements and to regulate muscle tone and posture. The thalamus acts as a relay station for virtually all of the information that flows into and out of the higher brain centers. The hypothalamus, it regulates hunger, thirst, sexual behavior, body temperature, our biological clock, and a variety of emotional behaviors. As small as it is, the hypothalamus maintains nearly all of our bodily functions except blood pressure, heart rhythm, and breathing. Now the forebrain, forwardmost part of the brain containing the thalamus, hypothalamus, limbic, and cerebrum. So let's look at those. The thalamus is a relay station for sensory stimulation for virtually all information that flows in and out of the brain in the higher centers. Hypothalamus is vital for the regulation of blood temperature, concentration of fluid, storage of nutrients, and various aspects of motivation and emotions. Also, it's involved in hunger, thirst, and sexual behavior. It's the pleasure center of the brain, and we see that in different experiments that have been done. The limbic system, this is made up of several structures including the amygdala, the hippocampus, and parts of the hypothalamus. It's involved in memory, emotions, and the drives of hunger, sex, and aggression. The amygdala, it's connected with aggression, our fear response, and our being vigilant. The hippocampus, now this part of the brain is associated with long-term memory and our mental mapping, pictures we make about understanding the world around us. The cerebrum, this is responsible for thinking and language. Surface of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. Now, we've mentioned that there's two sides of a brain. There's a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. The corpus callosum is a bundle of some 200 million nerve fibers that connect the two hemispheres together. Now, the cerebral cortex, structurally, the outer layer of the cerebrum, about 2 to 4 milliliters thick, involved in almost every bodily activity, including the most sensations and most responses, and it's divided into two hemispheres, with each hemisphere containing 4 lobes. The frontal lobe contains A, the motor cortex, which controls voluntary activity, B, the Broca's area, which functions in speech production, and C, the frontal association area, which are involved in thinking, motivation, planning for the future, impulse control, and emotional response. Now, the second lobe is known as a parietal lobe. Behind the central fissure, it contains the somatosensory cortex. This is where we experience touch, pressure, temperature, and pain, and other areas that are responsible for body awareness and spatial orientation. The third lobe is the temporal lobe. This lies below the lateral fissure and contains our artery. It's usually towards the back a bit and off to the side here, back and side. It involves with hearing, auditory, production of language, and that's its main areas, auditory. And then the occipital lobe, that's the fourth lobe, that lies behind the temporal lobe. Usually it sits towards the back and contains the somatosensory cortex, where touch, pressure, and temperature and pain register. So now let's look at thinking, language, and the cortex. Association areas. Now these are areas of the cerebral cortex that are not primarily involved in sensation or motor activities. They make possible the breadth and depth of human learning, thought, memory, and language. The prefrontal region of the brain, the frontal lobe, the brain's executive center, solving problems, planning, and making decisions. And then there's the language functions. Damage to the left hemisphere, where the Broca and the Wernicke's area are, can have language-related effect. Aphasia, for example, is the disruption of the ability to understand or produce language. Wernicke's area is the temporal lobe. It's in that area, and it responds mainly to auditory information. Broca's area processes information and sends it to the motor cortex. Wernicke's aphasia impairs the ability to comprehend speech and to think of the proper words to express. Broca's aphasia results from the damage to this area. People can understand language, but will speak slowly in simple sentences. These aphasias can result from concussions as well. So let's look at what differences there can be sex difference-wise in the human brain. Now, women's brains have more corpus callosum connectivity, resulting in processing, facilitating an analytic and intuitive thinking. It's got greater activation for empathy. Whereas men's brains are more connectivity to specific regions of the brain and less connectivity between hemispheres. The left and right brain, now, what do? Well, the left side, the left hemisphere, is primarily logical and intellectual. The right brain, primarily intuitive, creative, and emotional. At best, this is exaggerated. The hemispheres do not act independently as they are connected with the corpus callosum. Split brain experiments. So the research with split brain patients has expanded our knowledge of the unique capabilities of the individual hemispheres. A split brain operation is performed in severe cases of epilepsy, and it's an operation which the corpus callosum is cut, separating the two cerebral hemispheres. Usually what ends up as a result is a lessening of the severity and the frequency of grand mal seizures. Now, characteristics of split brain: each hemisphere seems to have a mind of its own. So if you're a person with split brain, so your corpus callosum has been split and your two sides don't communicate as effectively as well with one another, you may be able to describe an object that's in one of your hands, but only if it's in one hand, but may not be able to identify it in the other hand. That's how your brain could be, work so separately. And now some of this, people have had very successful and normal lives in spite of having that surgery. Some other new areas that have occurred in the last, say, 20 years is what's known as brain plasticity. And it's the remarkable ability of the brain to adapt and change. Research has shown that our brain adds brain cells as we grow older and can be reprogrammed or reorganized. Of course, this revelation can be great news for many people. Now, I'm sure this has been a lot of material for this chapter. It's very robust, as our brain is very robust. So in part 2, we're going to look at the endocrine system and the role of evolution and heredity on brain. All right, everybody, good luck, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.